If this Saturday evening you take your family out for steak in the UK, spending $60 to $100 on a fancy meal, there's one rather hard-to-swallow truth. In a lot of places, what's on your plate isn't a dream steak at all, but a pre-cooked piece of meat that's been sitting under a heat lamp for an hour and could even pose a risk to your family's health. This video will point out 5 steakhouses in the UK you should avoid at all costs, no matter how loudly they advertise prime, age to perfection, or family value steak night. And at the end, there will be 2 names that still respect the quality of the meat, the cooking technique, and basic hygiene, so that if you're going out for steak, you at least know you're paying for the real thing, not an illusion under warm yellow lights. We'll start with the place that looks like a little weekend treat, right up until you take a closer look at the steak and the bill. 5. Miller & Carter. Picture this. It's a Friday night. You've finally lined up babysitting. You've booked a table weeks in advance, and you walk into Miller & Carter feeling like you've earned it. The lights are soft and golden. Leather seats glow in that Instagram-friendly way. Glasses catch the light from the bar, and every little detail whispers the same message. This is not just dinner. This is a proper steakhouse for special occasions. You open the menu, and it reads almost like a love letter to beef. 30-day aged British and Irish cuts, Black Angus this, steak experts that, sirloins and ribeyes lounging comfortably in the 20 to 30 pound range before you even think about a starter, sides, or a bottle of wine. You tell yourself, fine, it's not cheap, but we're paying for craft, for people who actually know how to cook steak properly from field to plate. That's the promise. Now here's the reality. A lot of diners quietly describe in reviews. The plates arrive. The steak that sounded so indulgent on paper looks a bit thinner than you expected in real life. You cut into it and realize that medium rare has taken a detour somewhere between medium and why is this so grey? Maybe it's not inedible, maybe it's fine. But when you've just dropped 20-something quid on one piece of meat, fine is not exactly the dream. And it's not just a one-off bad night. If you scroll through enough feedback, you start to see a pattern. Steaks cooked past the point people asked for, inconsistent quality between branches, plates going out lukewarm on busy nights. Not every branch, not every time, but enough that steak experts starts to sound less like a statement of fact and more like a marketing department having a very good day. And that's only half the story. In at least one branch, a cluster of diners reporting feeling unwell afterwards led to a full deep clean and an investigation. The official inspection confirmed the hygiene rating stayed high. No clear breach was found. But that's exactly the point. In a high-volume chain, where steak and rich sauces are flying out of the kitchen all evening, it only takes one slip for an entire night of treat yourself to feel more like, why did we risk it? The machine has to run perfectly, every single shift. Real life doesn't always work like that. On top of that, the company behind Miller & Carter has openly talked about just how much beef prices have jumped in recent years. Rising wage bills, higher costs for steak, pressure across the casual dining sector. It all adds up. When a business tells investors it's facing tens of millions of pounds in extra costs, the money has to come from somewhere. Fewer cuts on the menu, quiet price rises, less room for generosity on the plate. You don't have to be a financial analyst to guess how easily that can turn into same price, slightly less. Wow. What makes this worse is that this is not a pub selling an 8-pound steak and chips where you know you're rolling the dice. This is a place where couples routinely hand over 80, 90, even £100 for steak, drinks, and dessert, because the brand tells them they're buying into expertise. And when your steak turns up overcooked in a beautiful room with polished glasses and soft lighting, a lot of people won't send it back. They sit there, cutting around the dry bits, telling themselves, maybe this is just how it's meant to be. The brand, the decor, the wine list, all of it nudges you to doubt your own taste buds before you dare question the steak experts. The irony is that at the same price point, plenty of people could walk a few streets further and find a small, butcher-led steakhouse where the owner can tell you exactly which farm your beef came from. But the way Miller & Carter is marketed, the special occasion feel, the sense of safety in a big, well-known chain, convinces many diners this is the benchmark for how good steak is supposed to look and taste. In a cost-of-living crisis, when a couple saves up for that one nice night out, they are not just buying food, they're buying trust. If you walk out thinking, it was okay, but I don't know if it was really worth what we paid, something breaks a little. Trust in the word premium, confidence to try new places. You retreat into the same big logos you already know, and ironically, that can make it harder to ever discover the independent spots that actually treat steak and customers with more respect. Personally, if a place calls itself a steak expert, but still leaves diners silently debating whether to send their steak back or just swallow the disappointment along with the meat, that doesn't feel like money well spent. The only consolation here is that at Miller & Carter, you're at least sitting in a pleasant room with a hot steak and a glass of wine. The Foo, next chain on this list. That's where people sometimes walk out questioning not just the steak on the plate, but the whole idea of going out for steak in the first place. 4. Angus Steakhouse. Number 4 on this list is the kind of place you recognize long before you ever read a review. You're in London for a few days. Maybe it's a first trip. Maybe it's the first time you've managed to come back since before the pandemic. You step out into the lights around Leicester Square or Piccadilly Circus, and there it is. A huge red sign shouting Angus Steakhouse since 1968. Neon glow on the pavement, menus pinned outside in big, friendly fonts, photos of thick-cut steaks, golden chips, and glossy cocktails. If you were to design a classic British steakhouse set for tourists, it would look exactly like this. The message is simple and very tempting. This is the London steak experience, famous for grilled steaks. Angus beef, a menu full of sirloin, ribeye, and filet, surrounded by baked potatoes, onion rings, and peppercorn sauce. It looks safe, familiar, almost comforting. And if you only have time for one steak dinner in London, it's very easy to think, well, this must be the place. It's been here forever. It must be good, right? That's the fantasy on the pavement. Inside, for a lot of diners, the story feels a bit different. If you go by the pattern in many write-ups and reviews, the words that come up are less legendary and more sad, tough, mass-produced. People describe steaks that arrive looking generous, but eat like something that's been through the same routine 1,000 times that week. Meat that's chewy instead of tender. Plates where the most memorable thing is how much it all cost rather than how it tasted. Food critics and travel writers have over the years pointed to Angus Steakhouse as a textbook example of a tourist trap restaurant in the West End. the sort of place that seems perfectly designed to catch people who are hungry, tired, and just want something familiar near the theatre or the cinema. On paper, it calls to mind a traditional London steakhouse. On the plate, a lot of diners report something closer to generic high-volume fare with a premium price tag. And that is where it starts to get more frustrating. Because the problem here isn't only that some people find the steak disappointing. The problem is where these restaurants are. Angus Steakhouse locations sit on some of the most expensive high-footfall corners in central London, right where tourists pour out from shows, sightseeing buses, and tube stations. These are the moments when people are least likely to spend half an hour researching independent spots 3 streets away. They look up, they see Steakhouse since 1968, and they think, that'll do. For a lot of visitors, this is their first, and sometimes only, steak in London. It becomes a reference point. They go home and tell friends, "We tried a steakhouse in the West End. It was okay, bit pricey, nothing special. London food is overrated, really. Feels like they just charge tourists." One average meal, multiplied by thousands of visitors, quietly shapes the way people talk about eating in the UK. Meanwhile, locals who actually live and work in London will often tell you they almost never eat there. The business can survive quite comfortably on the constant river of new customers who pass by its doors every night. If a restaurant can thrive without needing people to come back, you have to ask, how strong is the incentive to push for better value on the plate? A family of 4 can easily walk out having spent well over $150 once you add starters, drinks, and service to those main courses. And if the general feeling is, we could have had something similar at any generic touristy place in any big city, that's a lot of money for what is, in effect, a forgettable story. That's the part that bothers me the most. Not that people go once and decide they don't like it. That happens. It's that this one chain on this cluster of streets ends up representing London's steak for visitors who may never get to try the small butcher-led place in Soho, or the little bistro in Fitzrovia, or the neighbourhood pub that quietly serves a brilliant ribeye without a neon sign in sight. If you live in London, you probably learnt to read these signs a long time ago and steer around them. But if you're only here for a few days, with limited time and a limited budget, Angus Steakhouse is one of those names I'd gently suggest crossing off your bucket list before you even land. There are far better steaks, at fairer value, hidden just a couple of streets away. At least Angus mostly leans on tourists who will be gone by Monday. The next chain on this list aims its value pitch straight at local families, people who just want an affordable steak night. And what they get in return is a whole story about salad bars and hygiene ratings that's a lot harder to laugh off. 3. Harvester. Number 3 on this list is the kind of place that looks, on the surface, like a win for everyone in the family. It's a Sunday afternoon, the weather's not great, and you've promised the kids a meal out if they behave. You don't want anything too formal. You don't want to remortgage the house for one lunch, and you do vaguely want them to eat something green. So you pull into the car park, walk through the doors of Harvester, and it all feels reassuring. You can almost hear the inner monologue. This is fine. It's not a big fancy steakhouse, but we're getting something grilled. The kids can pile up some veg, and the bill should be manageable. This is us being sensible. But then the plates start to arrive, and the illusion begins to crack. If you read through enough reviews, there's a very familiar pattern. Steaks that are thinner than Expected, cooked well past the requested doneness and hitting the table lukewarm rather than sizzling. On a quiet night, you might get lucky. On a busy one, it often feels more like a conveyor belt than a grill. One branch can turn out something decent, while another, just a few miles away, sends out meat that tastes like it has been waiting politely under a heat lamp for its moment to be noticed. And that's before we even talk about hygiene. One harvester site famously hit a 0 hygiene rating, the lowest possible score, and had to shut voluntarily for a deep clean and retraining. To be fair, they did the right thing afterwards. Clean down, new systems, new oversight. But for a chain that trades so heavily on the idea of family-friendly comfort and that big central salad bar, seeing their crow next to your local branch's name is a jolt. Because once you've heard about one place falling that far, it's hard not to wonder how many others are just one inspection away from the same result. And here's where it gets even more ironic. That salad bar that makes everyone feel better about the meal. The thing that lets you say, at least the kids are eating salad. Take a closer look at what actually ends up in those bowls. Pasta salad coated in mayonnaise, coleslaw heavy with creamy dressing, bacon bits, crunchy fried toppings, cheese, thick sweet dressings. For a lot of people, the healthy option quietly turns into a mountain of carbs, fat, and salt that can rival the steak itself. So you end up with a plate that looks extremely virtuous, a grill on one side, a big colourful bowl of salad on the other. But nutritionally, it's not that far removed from a very enthusiastic fast food order. If a family is doing the full steak plus salad bar plus dessert routine 2 or 3 times a month, it doesn't take much imagination to see how quickly that can sail past what health guidelines would consider a sensible intake of red meat, calories, and sodium. The most uncomfortable part is the psychology of it. Harvester's whole pitch makes you feel like you've found a middle ground. Not junk, not fancy, just honest value. You get to feel like a good parent because there's salad involved, and like a smart shopper because you're not paying Miller and Carter prices. But when you strip away the branding, what you often have is a very ordinary steak cooked in a hurry, surrounded by ultra-processed sides dressed up as something fresh. And again, we come back to the hygiene question. Once a chain has had a site drop to rock bottom on food safety, yes, it can recover. Ratings can and do improve. But as a consumer, it forces you into an awkward little internal audit. Am I checking the hygiene score before I sit down? Or am I just trusting the logo and the salad bar to mean someone, somewhere, has it all under control? Personally, if a restaurant makes me feel healthy purely by parking a salad counter in the middle of the room, while at least one branch has at some point hit the lowest hygiene rating on the scale, that's not a place I'd want to hand my family's treat night to too often. At least Harvester is honest enough to call itself a grill and salad bar, not a temple of steak. The next chain on this list goes a step further. It sells the idea of a budget-friendly steak night so aggressively that when their meat supplier ran into serious trouble, the whole system had to stop and ask what on earth had been going on behind the scenes. 2. Wetherspoon. Number 2 on this list is not a steakhouse with leather banquettes and candlelight. It's the opposite. It's the place you end up when you just want something hot with a pint and you don't particularly feel like cooking. The local Wetherspoon is 10 minutes away. You know roughly what a round of drinks costs, and as you walk up, you see the poster pinned proudly outside. Steak Club. A big glossy photo of steak, chips, peas, and a drink with a price that starts somewhere around 8 to 13 quid. For the UK in 2025, that's enough to make you pause. Inside, the pitch is simple. Great value steak and drink. Fresh, non-frozen steaks with full traceability. Nobody's pretending this is fine dining. The whole point is that you don't need to dress up, you don't need to book, and you don't need to justify it to your bank account. You're not asking for perfection. You're thinking, I'm not expecting a Michelin star. I just want a half-decent steak, a pint, and change from £20. On paper, it sounds fair. In practice, the story has been a bit messier. Back in 2018, the name Wetherspoon Steak suddenly started appearing in the news for all the wrong reasons. The Food Standards Agency opened an investigation into a major meat supplier called Russell Hume over what they described as serious non-compliance, problems with traceability and food safety controls. Wetherspoon was one of the chains using that supplier. Overnight, they pulled steak from the menu across hundreds of pubs because nobody was sure exactly what had gone wrong at the production end. To their credit, they did remove it and later switched supplier. But the incident left a question hanging in the air that never really goes away once you've heard it. If the FSA hadn't walked in and started asking awkward questions, how many thousands of steak meals would have gone on being served? No one, any the wiser. And that's only one side of the deal. Talk to enough regulars, or just read the reviews, and a familiar description of Steak Club emerges. Plates where the steak is noticeably thin, meat cooked a good shade beyond what people asked for, or arriving with that strange in-between texture that feels more reheated than freshly grilled. On a good night, you might get something you'd happily call decent for the money. On a bad one, it leans closer to, this could just as easily have come out of a freezer box. Now layer in the rest of the tray. A cheap steak deal doesn't travel alone. It comes with chips, onion rings or peas, maybe a sauce that's more packet than pan, and almost always a drink, often alcoholic, because that's half the appeal. The whole thing starts to look less like quick, affordable dinner and more like a neat little package of red meat, alcohol, and ultra-processed sides that just happens to be printed under the words great value. On its own, once in a while, that's not the end of the world. The problem is what happens when Steak Club stops being an occasional treat and becomes the default. If you're dropping in once or twice a week because it's cheap, nearby, and you're tired, the amount of red meat, saturated fat, salt, and booze you're taking in quietly drifts a long way from what most health guidelines would call sensible. And there's another, more subtle effect. When you regularly eat steak at this level, thin, inconsistent, just about fine if you drown it in sauce, your idea of what normal steak tastes like starts to shift. This becomes the baseline. So when you look at an independent place charging a bit more for better beef, good hygiene, and someone actually standing at a grill paying attention, your first reaction is, that's stupidly expensive. The irony is that you're comparing a carefully cooked piece of properly sourced meat to a product designed first and foremost to hit a price point. No one is saying you're not allowed to enjoy a pub steak once in a while. Life is short, and sometimes you just want to sit in a Wetherspoon with a plate of food and a cheap pint and not think too hard about it. But when a chain has, in living memory, had to pull steak from every single branch because their supplier was being investigated over serious food safety issues, It's probably not the place to hang your long-term trust, especially for that weekly steak night you've convinced yourself is harmless. In the end, Steak Club is exactly what it says on the tin: a cheap way to eat steak in a pub. It's when that cheapness becomes routine, and when one supplier's problems can ripple through an entire national menu overnight, that the cracks in the bargain start to show. Still, Wetherspoon only ever treats steak as one line on a long pub menu. The chain at number 1 on this list is different. It's almost built around the idea that the whole country should be tucking into roast and steak under the warm glow of heat lamps. And when that system goes wrong, it's not just a few regulars who have a bad night. It's hundreds of people watching their bank holiday turn into something much uglier. 1. Toby Carvery. Number 1 on this list isn't just a restaurant, it's a ritual. The sign over the door says it all. Home of the roast. Posters talk about proper Sunday lunch your nan would approve of. The message is very clear. If you want the full British roast experience without wrecking your kitchen, this is where you go. Inside, the deal looks unbeatable. For £7 to £9 a head, you get a plate stacked with roast beef, gammon, turkey, piles of potatoes, Yorkshire pudding, carrots, peas, the works. For a lot of families, it feels like a no-brainer. Why would we spend all day cooking when we can get this much food for that price? You line up at the Carvery station, tray in hand, watching the chef carve under the warm glow of the heat lamps. The whole thing is set up to feel like a slightly upgraded version of Sunday at home. Bit of a queue, bit noisy, but cozy. Grandad jokes that his plates were never this full. The kids are eyeing up the dessert menu. On the surface, it's almost perfect. But the story behind those heat lamps hasn't always been so comforting. A few years ago, one Toby Carvery in Exeter became the center of a norovirus outbreak that left hundreds of people reportedly ill. It turned what should have been a simple meal out into a minor local disaster, with compensation later paid out to large numbers of diners. Other branches at different times have been picked up by local councils with hygiene ratings down at 0 or 1, the bottom of the scale, because of issues with cleanliness, pests, or built-up grime in the very places food is prepared. To be clear, many Toby Carvery sites now hold very good hygiene scores, but the model itself carries a built-in risk that has to be managed perfectly. Big joints of meat, trays of vegetables, and jugs of gravy, all kept warm under lights for long stretches of a busy service. Carvery is, by design, hot holding on an industrial scale. If the temperature control slips, if serving utensils aren't handled properly, if cleaning routines aren't followed to the letter, any mistake can be multiplied across an entire dining room in a single lunchtime. And this is where it gets worse, because this isn't just where people go for a quick solo lunch. This is where people go for birthdays, for 3 generations at one table, for those big family catch-ups that only happen once or twice a year. This is where you take the grandparents, the toddlers, the friend who's just out of hospital and needs to get out of the house. When a setup like that isn't run to the standards the Food Standards Agency expects, the people who pay the price are not just 1 or 2 unlucky customers. It can be whole family groups, churches, clubs, entire communities over a single weekend. And the most uncomfortable part? The whole experience is wrapped in the language of home, like a roast at home. Your nan would approve. Yet behind the scenes, it has to operate like a high-throughput canteen. Fast, efficient, volume first. In that kind of environment, there's always a temptation to focus on keeping the line moving, topping up the gravy, making sure the Yorkies don't run out, and it becomes very easy to forget to ask the unglamorous questions like, how long has that joint actually been sitting under the lamp? Food poisoning from a roast buffet isn't just a couple of unpleasant days. For older people, young children, or anyone with an existing health condition, it can be genuinely serious. And once you've seen the headlines about an outbreak at a Toby Carvery, it's very hard not to replay every previous visit in your head. Every time you took a plate for your kids, every extra slice you gave to your parents, because it's a shame to waste it. Trust takes a long time to build and one weekend to crack. When a chain that presents itself as the nation's roast dinner living room lets hygiene slip far enough for some branches to hit the bottom of the scale, you can't help but wonder what's really being prioritized: the family on the other side of the counter or the numbers on the till. Not every Toby Carvery is bad. Plenty of sites quietly keep their 5-star ratings and do the hard work properly. But after the outbreaks and the low scores we've seen, this is probably not the chain you want to treat as the default every time you're thinking of taking 3 generations out for roast and steak under somebody else's roof. The good news is this: not every place serving steak in the UK is playing value games or gambling with hygiene. There are still spots that get it right, that care about where the meat comes from, how it's cooked, and what's actually written on the menu. And those are the kinds of names we need to talk about next. 1. Hawksmoor. After all of those steak horror stories, it's only fair to admit, not every steakhouse in the UK is playing games. Walk into a Hawksmoor on a Friday night, and you can feel, almost immediately, that this is a very different kind of promise. Most branches sit right in the middle of things: city offices, West End theatres, Manchester and Edinburgh city centres. But when you step inside, it doesn't feel like a gimmicky high street chain. Dark wood, brown leather, soft amber light. More classic British steakhouse than Instagram trap. You don't get the sense you're paying for neon. You get the sense you're paying for the person at the grill and the cow that got you here. On the wall or the blackboard, cuts of the animal are mapped out, today's steaks are listed by weight, and the menu reads like someone actually cares where every piece came from. And that's the point. At Hawksmoor, they don't hide the beef, they spell it out. Native breed, grass-fed British cattle from small farms slowly reared on grass and hay until the meat actually has flavor of its own. Then they take the best of those cuts and dry age them for around 35 days in purpose-built rooms, trading away water and weight in exchange for depth and tenderness. It's the same story behind their famous Sunday roast, a whole rump of 35-day dry-aged beef, cooked low and slow, first over real charcoal, then finished in the oven, before it ever meets a Yorkshire pudding. In other words, this is not meat pulled from a bag and shoved under a heat lamp. Steaks are grilled to order over coals. Roasts are handled in batches with tight control over time and temperature, and the supporting cast is taken seriously. Triple cooked chips, creamed spinach, cauliflower cheese, bone marrow gravy. All the little details that, in lesser places, feel like afterthoughts, here show up in reviews as part of the reason people keep coming back. Just as importantly, Hawksmoor doesn't lean on the usual tricks. Yes, there are huge sharing cuts, porterhouse, prime rib, T-bone, but they're clearly labelled with honest weights and an obvious distinction between bone and edible meat. Butter, peppercorn, béarnaise, and anchovy hollandaise are treated as accents, not as thick makeup to cover a dry steak. The menu isn't padded with mountain-sized piles of anonymous carbs to fake value. The plate looks generous because the ingredients actually are. Is it cheap? No. And with British beef prices jumping sharply in the last couple of years, Hawksmoor has had to nudge up portions and prices like everyone else. But here, the money is visibly on the plate. Native breed, grass-fed cattle, dry-aged for weeks, cooked over real fire by people whose whole job is to get the doneness right. That's why so many diners describe it as a celebration of British beef and talk about the consistency, medium rare arriving as medium rare, again and again. Hawksmoor is proof that in the UK, steak can still be treated as a serious craft. Tell the truth about the animal. Tell the truth about the aging. Cook it over real heat. And charge what you need to charge, without hiding anything under the glow of a heat lamp. Of course, not everyone can afford a Hawksmoor night every month. The good news is there are places trying to keep steak honest at a more everyday price by choosing smarter cuts and working closely with farmers, like the next name on this list. After all the chains that treated steak like a prop, it's almost a shock to walk into somewhere that looks normal. No chandeliers, no cowboy murals, no salad bar glowing like a spaceship. Just flat iron. Most people in London first meet it by accident. A narrow doorway in Soho, a queue in Shoreditch, a cozy dining room just off a busy street in Covent Garden. These days, the name pops up across the city and beyond. Cambridge, Leeds, South Bank. But the feeling inside is the same. Wooden tables, a view of the open kitchen, staff in simple aprons, and a menu that you can read in about 30 seconds. No fuss, no frills, just the quiet confidence of a place that has decided to do one thing well. Your first thought, looking at that menu, might even be suspicion. One main steak, called flat iron, and a handful of specials on the board. That's it. No 20 different cuts, no endless list of chef's signature, this and that. But flat iron actually tells you what that cut is. A piece taken from the feather blade in the shoulder, not as famous as ribeye or fillet, but naturally marbled and full of flavor, if it's butchered properly. They talk openly about working with small farms in Britain and Ireland, with traditional breeds that are allowed to grow slowly, instead of being rushed to wait. The message is clear. The steak is affordable because they're smart about the cut and the way they buy, not because they've cut corners on the cow. Behind the scenes, they even have their own butchery, where those lesser-known cuts are seam butchered by hand each week. That work allows the kitchens to focus. When almost everyone in the Rue-Cum is ordering the same core steak, the grill cooks can concentrate on getting it right, plate after plate, without relying on heat lamps or batch-cooked trays. And then there are the things flat iron doesn't do. There's no bone in Thorsantio's spectacle meant to hide the fact that half the weight is inedible. There's no mountain of free, all-you-can-eat carbs to distract you from a sad slice of meat. The sides, dripping chips, creamed spinach, salad, a bit of veg, are straightforward and solid, not a sugar-loaded buffet dressed up as healthy. Butter and sauces exist, but they're accents, not a thick layer of makeup to rescue a tired steak. In a cost-of-living crisis, flat iron sits in an unusual spot. It isn't pub cheap, but it's far below the Hawksmoor tier, and that's deliberate. Even when rising beef prices force them to nudge that famous flat iron steak from £14 to £15, they were open about why. Paying farmers properly, paying staff properly, and still keeping the bill at a level where steak doesn't have to be a once-a-year event. If chains like Steak Club normalize the idea that cheap and forgettable is just how steak has to be, Flatiron quietly argues the opposite, that you can know the cut, know the farm, and still walk out feeling like you paid for the meat on your plate, not for a logo and a light show. Hawksmoor shows steak can be treated as a serious craft. Flatiron proves that even in a belt-tightening Britain, you can still eat honest steak without hiding anything under a heat lamp, and that in the UK, there are still places that treat a steak as a promise, not a performance. When you strip away the sizzle, tonight's list really boils down to one thing. Not every big plate of meat, bone, and butter is worth your money. A steak doesn't magically become good value just because there's a giant bone, a mountain of carbs, and a river of melted fat on top. The real difference is whether you're paying for a piece of beef that's been sourced, aged, and cooked with care, or for an illusion on the menu and a bit of theatre under warm yellow lights. So maybe the next time you go out for steak, you don't just follow the biggest sign or the loudest steak night deal. You look at the hygiene rating, you ask where the beef comes from, you see how confidently the staff answer one simple question about what's on your plate. Out of the 5 names today, which one surprised you the most? Did your regular steakhouse show up? Or are you quietly side-eyeing somewhere we haven't mentioned yet? If you want more videos that pull back the curtain on UK restaurant tricks, from buffets and all-you-can-eat sushi to bottomless brunch, drop the name of the chain or local spot that feels a bit off to you. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next episode, we're flipping the script, counting down the places that still treat steak and your wallet with real respect.